Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to our channel and thanks for logging on. Today, 6 hands, 2 watches, time only, stainless steel. It's the Omega Railmaster Trilogy versus the Rolex Oyster Perpetual Explorer 214270. Let the games begin. Now, the Trilogy is the less familiar of the 2 watches. It's based on the historic late 1950s, well, I should say 1957 specifically, reference 2914. So that was the original Railmaster. It was considered to be a technician-style watch, very much in the mold of the Milgauss. A simplified 3-hand watch revived for 2017 on the occasion of its 60th anniversary. It was called the Trilogy because it launched alongside a new Seamaster 300 and a Speedmaster 1957 tribute. So effectively 3 vintage re-editions in a total of 3,557 pieces per watch. Now, the timepiece right here is very much a heritage design. Everything from the slender case band to the cartoonishly bubble-shaped sapphire to the simulated patina of the dial. It speaks to a 1950s proportion and aesthetic sensibility that makes this one feel a little bit more self-consciously retro than the evergreen Explorer. Now, let's throw it on the wrist. You can see the clasp very much of modern design, but that's not how the watch appears on the wrist, and we will get it back in focus right there. Give ourselves a little bit more contrast. You can see that it's an easy piece on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist to wear with elegance and proportion. Being 38 millimeters in diameter, it does have a traditional look on the wrist, although historically a little bit smaller even than this. The timepiece looks straight out of the late 1950s. 38 millimeters in diameter, 12.8 millimeters thick, and you can see lug-to-lug 48 millimeters. It's not a tiny or petite watch as its historic forebear truly would be to modern sensibilities. 19 millimeters between the lugs, so it is a bit of a narrow lug spacing, another feature that's characteristic of older watches, particularly those from the 50s. That said, Omega pretty much checks its retro aesthetic and engineering where the bracelet begins. And at the gates of the end link, you can see that we begin an entirely different journey into the modern era, with the bracelet fairly massive, substantial, differential finish, both polish and satin, staggered link alignment, staggered link size, individual removable links fixed by screws. This is nothing like what you would find on the 1957 2914 original. You can see there is a vintage style Omega logo on the clasp, so that's a particular piece, but the clasp design itself is contemporary Omega. Mostly satin finished, milled out from the solid, with a polished bevel and twin trigger release. Internally, there is a push-button slider that gives you 9.6 millimeters of incremental adjustment, so it's a bit more incremental than the all-or-nothing Rolex EasyLink system, but it doesn't have the additional stationing points inside the clasp that you get with the Rolex bracelet. This is a very modern clasp and a little bit more convenient to use than the system you'll get on the Rolex, and we'll explain that in a moment. But first, let's discuss the case lines. Although the timepiece is thicker than the Rolex being only 11.2 to this watch is 12.8, you can see a lot of that loft is in the bubble of the sapphire, not the case band, which has a slim, slender, and minimally beveled profile that's evocative of late 1950s Omega sports watches. You can see that continues right down to the logo on the crown with the tri-spoke at center. And of course, a combination of polish and satin. The ends of the lugs are squared off. This is the kind of definition and full metal body and contrast that you will never see on a historic survivor, as they tend to be worn down and polished with age. This is as crisp as 1957. Now we'll give ourselves a bit more light, get closer to the dial, and you can see Omega looking for the heritage aesthetic. It starts with the bubble and the distortion created by that plexiglass-like sapphire, and it continues onto a dial that is matte black, really almost more anthracite gray than black, broad arrow style hour hand, an extended Dauphine style minute hand, counterweighted Lancet style needle seconds hand, a vintage Omega logo and marquee at 12 o'clock. The indices all simulated aged patina, but crafted of modern superluminova. There's a vintage Railmaster script at 6 o'clock, and the timepiece with quarter Arabics is simple, it's elemental, it's beautiful in a way the somewhat over-adorned and over-printed Rolex dial doesn't quite manage to be. Less is more here, and it really shows. Now turn the watch over, and you'll see an uncommon use of a solid case back on a modern Omega timepiece. I'm going to avail myself of a polishing cloth, remove some of those oil deposits, and we'll take a look at the hippocampus, the historic seahorse logo that is a signature of the Seamaster family and watches within the Seamaster family. Now you can see the timepiece, part of a limited edition of 3,557 pieces, and if you were to turn everything over and look at the engraving on the case back, you can see that this is a coaxial master chronometer. That's right, it's both a coaxial and a METAS certified chronometer. 55-hour power reserve, full balance bridge, free sprung, silicone hairspring, amagnetic, 60 meters water resistant with a push-down crown. This one, perhaps not a hardcore all-around sports watch so much as a sporty dress model by modern standards, but handsome, wearable, evocative, and due to the low production, comparatively rare relative to the innumerable Rolex Explorers in the world. Speaking of which, let's talk about the Rolex Explorer in its latest iteration. While the Explorer name predates the 1950s, both the Explorer as we know it today and the Railmaster were children of the Atom Age at its peak, and this Explorer, 39mm, gained this case size in 2010. It gained the fully loomed dial with the luminescent tri-Arabics in 2016, so that's when this particular variant of the Explorer bowed. You can see it uses the more deluxe Rolex Clasp design with a clamshell and a lift lock system. Throwing it on the wrist, the first thing you notice, and we'll get it in focus, we'll give ourselves a bit more contrast, the first thing you notice is that it does have more body and presence and wrist real estate than the Omega. Despite being a 39 to the Omega's 38, this appears far larger, not incrementally larger. It fills my 16cm circumference wrist. Even though lug-to-lug, it's only 0.9mm, so 9/10 of a millimeter broader. Even with the solid end links across the wrist than the Omega, it's that it's broader. It's also a slimmer watch, and it ducks down lower relative to a cuff. Either of these watches will slip under any sleeve because of the slope of the case flanks, but elegance is a virtue in and of itself, and it's largely a function of aspect ratio. This watch being incredibly slim and incredibly broad looks more elegant than the Omega. Now, the timepiece features a 20mm spacing between the lugs, and it's one of the few Rolex watches that looks natural on a strap rather than the Rolex bracelet. It looks good on the bracelet, but don't be beholden to it. You've got options, and the watch looks great on an Everest or Rubber B. You can see that this is not quite a flagship Rolex piece, as it lacks the central polished stripe down the center links, but it is polished on its flanks. It does feature the double lock with the hook and beak system internally, as well as the clamshell to ensure it is sure tight. And then it also features the Easy Link system, which you will not necessarily find on other entry-level Rolex models. This is not the absolute entry level, as you'll find the comparably sized and powered Rolex Oyster Perpetual 39 does not have this Easy Link capability built into its clasp. And if you look inside the clasp, you'll see there are 3 different stationing points, 3 divots drilled into the clasp, so you can actually use a strap tool to change the location of the root of the bracelet inside the clasp. So you have removable links, you have Easy Link, which is a 5mm all-or-nothing system, then you have those 3 divots for localizing the root of the bracelet. Jump into the case, you can see it's handsome and a bit more contemporary than the Omega. Whereas the Omega has that highly squared off, minimally beveled vintage look to it, you can see how that contrasts with the fluid flow of the Explorer's case. This is anything but the squared off, sheer-sided modern Rolex super case that you'll see on the Sub, the Sea Dwellers, and the Explorer 2s. Now jump into the dial. Few more iconic visions in the world of luxury watches. The tri-Arabics, the triangular index, the white gold hour indices, the white gold hands, the Mercedes hour, the counterweighted and loomed needle style lollipop hand, beautiful stuff, but there is more text on this dial and it is not all necessary. So on that count, at least, advantage Omega. Inside the case, Rolex 3132 automatic winding 48-hour power reserve, parachrome hairspring, full balance bridge. It has a free sprung index. It is a Rolex superlative chronometer, which means Rolex attests to this watch's precision from the factory of no worse than -2 + 2 seconds per day. Omega makes no comparable vow of accuracy. 100 meters water resistant with a screw down twin lock crown. It is substantially more watertight than the Omega. Let's talk a little bit about what the advantages of the Explorer are. First and foremost, Rolex prestige. Omega is a great house with a grand history, and if we were discussing this comparison in 1957, you might conclude that Omega was the market hegemon, certifying more chronometers and shipping more watches than Rolex, with a broader recognition globally. But today, Rolex is king. So from a status and stature measure, the Rolex wins on that count. Also important, this is not a tribute watch. This is is like the Porsche 911. It's a grand design that has evolved slowly with measured increments, never creating planned obsolescence of previous models, nor deviating so much that a new model qualifies as a true redesign. Therefore, this is not a tribute watch or a re-edition. It is an always been, not a had been. Let's also talk about the water resistance. 100 meters is swimmable with a screw-down crown. With a push-down crown, I'm not sure I consider the Omega to be a swimmable watch. With the Rolex, I have no doubts. Let's talk a little bit about the store value factor. This is a watch that sells new for $6,550. Pre-owned, it sells for $6,500 to $7,000. The Omega sells new for $6,800, so it actually costs a bit more. Pre-owned, it's about $5,000 to $5,500 US dollars. So advantage Rolex on that count. I'll also mention that the watch is slimmer and more elegant, a more natural match for a suit on that basis, and although the Clasp does not have a push-button slider, nor does it have twin trigger release, with the increments inside that you can access with the strap tool and EasyLink, it winds up offering more degrees of adjustment than the outwardly more sophisticated Omega Clasp. And finally, for me, this watch has an authenticity factor. Being a constant in the catalog, it never went out of production, it has never been discontinued. It has been with Rolex every step of the way, from that final step to the summit of Mount Everest by Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. I'm not necessarily a fan of the watch's heritage, but I appreciate that it is not simply a flight of fancy, voguish reissue like so many vintage reeditions of our time. In that sense, it will not date or become a cliche. Let's talk about the advantages of the Omega. First and foremost, rarity. 3,557 pieces made versus tens of thousands of Explorers since the 39mm case showed up in 2010. Let's talk about the true vintage look. This is a watch that frankly pulls off the reissue aesthetic better than most, to the point that if you aren't into vintage watches or a sophisticated connoisseur of the type, you might mistake this for a true vintage watch. Now, the bracelet and the clasp should disabuse you of that notion, but going strictly by the dial, the crystal, and the case, Omega absolutely nailed it. If you want the vintage aged look, specifically, this watch delivers that better than the Rolex. I'll also mention that in terms of small wrist fit, if you have that smaller wrist under, let's say, 14 centimeters circumference, this is the obvious choice. Narrower from lug to lug, and also slimmer from side to side, not in thickness, but from side to side at 38 millimeters. This is the one for the small wrist. Also important to mention, tech, though you can't see it, you're getting an awful lot of it. Amagnetic, not anti-magnetic, with the silicone hairspring. You can wear this one near an MRI. The coaxial escapement rather than Rolex's Swiss lever. Also a 55-hour power reserve against the 48-hour power reserve of the Rolex. So there's a lot of technology inside this watch. You can't see it, but you can benefit from it. The clasp, most folks are going to say they simply prefer the trigger release system and the push button slider. Perhaps not as versatile as the system in the Rolex clasp, but you don't need a strap tool to access it. And the clasp itself feels more solid. There's more material there. Hewn from a solid ingot, it feels that way. Let's talk about the better pre-owned buy. A watch that sells for more than the Rolex new and less than the Rolex pre-owned has to be considered a wonderful pre-owned acquisition, as both of these watches now offer 5-year warranties. You're going to be able to buy either one of them pre-owned with years more than the once industry standard 2-year warranty. You can pick this watch up straight out of the dealer's case a few months old with most of the 5-year warranty intact, and no sacrifice, as you also pay a pre-owned price. No reason not to get this watch pre-owned. Finally, unexpected, because you might expect Rolex's proprietary chromolite system on a modern non-patina style watch to glow brighter at night. Instead, it's actually the Omega's dial that is more legible after dark. We're going to do a loom shot and showcase that, but the Omega is the easier watch to see in the dark. So on that basis, which one do I prefer? Honestly, though I'm an Omega man and I love the brand broadly, specifically I love the Rolex more. I like the fact that it's not a retro re-edition. It's not one of those fad of the moment styles that may not seem quite as cool 5 years down the line when retro watches are no longer the thing. I love the elegance of its broad and flat case. I love the fact that Rolex goes out on the limb and puts its money where its mouth is, guaranteeing an accuracy and then backing it with a 5-year warranty. So potentially 4 years down the line, if this watch runs 3 seconds a day, you could make a warranty claim and Rolex would be on the hook to pay for it. That's bold on Rolex's part, and there are whispers of 10-year service intervals with the tech and the lubricants inside this watch. So between the two, I'm going with the Rolex. Tried and tested it doesn't have to make its case to me. I'm already convinced. You guys, let me know which of these you would prefer to throw on your wrist. Surprise, surprise, both highly legible, but the Omega is just plain brighter.